Thank you, President Hay. Thank you for coming. Tim Carney, I think we're going to have some fun over this next hour. He's the commentary editor at the Washington Examiner, visiting fellow at the American Enterprise Institute, and he went to St. John's College in Annapolis, where, much like students here, he actually learned that there are great books and they're still worth reading, even though some of them may be more than 10 years old. So, and he wrote 2 previous books before the one we're talking about today, and these books both had titles. I don't think you'd be able to guess where he was coming from politically with these titles. The first one was The Big Ripoff, how big business and big government steal your money. And the second was Obamonomics, how Barack Obama is bankrupting you and enriching his Wall Street friends. This next one has a more mellow title, Alienated America, Why Some Places Thrive While Others Collapse. And we're going to talk first a little bit of political philosophy, then we're going to come down the ladder of abstraction and talk some about street-level economics, and then some of the political manifestations that you write about in the book. But it's really a good book. I enjoyed reading it. It's both incisive and fun to read. And let me just ask about where you're coming from. You've described your political prescriptions at times as free market populism. Tell us what that means.
So I definitely have always been very skeptical of both concentrations of government power and concentrations of business power. I think that when things get too far removed from the human level, power is abused, people lose their way, power is wielded in ways that's not in the interest of individuals. But on the other hand, I think while writing Alienated America, I became a little more sensitive about the dangers of hyper-individualism. That certainly it's what I was as a high school, was somebody who's just way too individualistic, not understanding the idea of community spirit, and then come around to while writing this one to say, okay, in Washington, D.C., yes, I'm still basically a libertarian. Most of the work I do, the editorials I write at the Examiner, et cetera, are based on saying the federal government should stop doing this thing. But if I'm a libertarian, sort of 9 to 5, I'm a conservative in the other hours, would be what I say. I realize the importance of tradition and history, and as I try to drive home in this book, community, something that, and that the enemy of the biggest check on big government is not going to be just a totally free individual, but is going to be a strong local community. And I think that sort of ties together my libertarian populism with what I'm trying to do in Alienated America.
Okay. You've shown how big government in terms of regulation, subsidies, and forth hurts individuals, but you're not also a corporatocrat in the sense of crony capitalism.
The argument of the first 2 books and a lot of my columns at the Examiner is that big business lobbies for and profits from big government, in part because regulation kills smaller companies and big guys can survive it. Tons of examples. Philip Morris lobbying for federal regulation of tobacco is one example. But then also when you increase the power of government, you're multiplying the importance of a lobbyist. Say you hire a former senator as your lobbyist, that's worth a lot more when government is regulating, subsidizing, mandating more. And so in all of these things, I think all conservatives, all free market people need to be very skeptical of business, because their agenda in Washington isn't just leave us alone. It's often give us special favors in the form of bigger government.
Corporate welfare, in other words. So, okay. Now, let's then turn to economics and get down to what's happened to jobs. There was a jobs report that just came out that, as opposed to February, that was pretty meager. March is much better. But in a way, when we talk about 3.8% unemployment right now, that doesn't count the 10% or so of people who have given up. So could you tell, when we look at those statistics and we see people playing with those numbers, what's really going on in the economy?
So in the last few years, there's definitely been an improvement in the employment situation all over. And just in the last couple months, there's been an uptick in sort of average wages. And obviously when the workforce is, hundreds of millions of people, average wages, there's lots of things that move the average. But the fact that for years, the labor force participation rate has been going down is part of the problem here. And it's not just a matter of, that doesn't include people who are retired. That doesn't include people who are, it doesn't include stay-at-home moms. It includes, it mostly includes people dropping out of the labor force, and disproportionately, the research done by my AI colleague, Nick Ebersat, says a lot of these are men with no college degree. So we've had this big problem of men just dropping out of the labor force. So they don't count in the unemployment statistics, but they do count as, but they clearly do represent people suffering economically. And I would argue that one of the main things, and that the changing economy has made it harder for men without a college degree to find good work. And so that's one of the reasons that they are dropping out of the labor force.
And you write in Alienated America that the typical male worker actually earns less today than in 1969.
That's right. And actually one of the interesting things in there is Elizabeth Warren did a study about how what's happened since 1969. There's lots of factors. Big part of it is just more competition from immigrants and more competition from more women working. So the increase in dual income families has put a lot of people in a more fragile, perilous position. It's been very good for the upper income, the most educated, but for the middle class and the working class, what Elizabeth Warren argues is that it puts them in a position where now the bigger labor force, wages for the working class stagnates or goes down, and then the family becomes totally dependent on both those incomes coming in, which is a lot more fragile of a situation to be in.
So looking at it from 30,000 feet and just talking about gross national product and national wealth doesn't really cut it as far as what's going on Main Street.
No, and certainly not. A lot of these numbers can fool you unless you look under the surface and see what's going on. And that's why one of the things I talk about again and again throughout the book is the importance of place. It's so easy for policymakers, economists, columnists to see all human beings lined up in columns and rows of age and sex and income and education level, but people don't live in those columns and rows. People live in places, and it's one of the things some of the best economics of recent years has really looked at that, and I try to look at is what is going on in the places where people live, and that's where you can see there really is an immense inequality. All these averages hide the real turbulence below the surface.
And how many miles did you travel in doing research for this book?
That can be almost a hard question to answer because the oldest research in that book is an interview I did in Bloomington, Indiana in 2005.
Okay.
And so I was a columnist for the Washington Examiner, and before that working for Bob Novak for years. But it takes me from New York down to Salt Lake City, and certainly a lot of stuff going on in the upper Midwest. So these were trips I did covering the factory closing in 2005, the elections in 2008 through 2012, 14, and 16, all of those where I was out there often looking for a specific story for a column, and then slowly the bigger story started presenting itself to me.
So 25 to 54-year-old men, prime working time, percentage of non-workers went from 3% to 12% over the past 50 years. So big change. And there's a parallel. The percentage of unmarried 21 to 35-year-old adults went from 17% to 57%.
Yep.
So connect the dots. Marriage, work.
Certainly, marriage, work, and I think the line that connects them is in part going to be community, which might sound odd at first, but the fact is that the drop-off in marriage, sometimes conservatives assume that this is, I call it the Lena Dunham fallacy, the false belief that marriage is disappearing because upper middle class women are graduating from Wesleyan with their women's studies majors and swearing off men or getting in polyamorous relationships or something like that. That's not statistically what's happening. America, marriage, fewer people are married today. Some of it is a delay in marriage among the highly educated, but most of the drop-off in marriage, the actual people who aren't married at age 40, that's mostly happening in the working class, women who did not go to college. men who did not go to college, and the divorce rate is higher among that population. So then you do see that the economic factor is a big part of this. It's harder for men to find stable, steady work. So the stableness, that's a huge part of family, right? Like, one of the men I talked to in the book, he's a Cambodian immigrant, and when he was married and doing really well as a real estate agent, his wife said, "You have to get a steady job." And he said, "We might make less money." And she said, "I need the stability. Family is a very long-term undertaking, right? You need stability." So a lot more men are in sort of gig economy jobs in very recent years. But also, the falling of the wages, there's less of an economic incentive for women to get married. And the irony is that some people on the left will celebrate this as, okay, so then the retreat from marriage is a fact of liberation. But no, again, the elites, the people with the most education and the most money, are getting married at much higher rates. So it's not the most liberated women who are getting married, it's the women who are in places where there aren't a lot of great options. So I say community because I argue, where I get at in chapter 5 of the book is trying to argue that I think if you just say, oh, well, poor wages is why working class people aren't getting married, you're missing half the story. I really do think it is about the erosion of strong community ties, community support that props up family.
Now, economically, some look at these figures and say, well, free trade is the problem, and if we had more tariffs, then that would actually protect these jobs. But you point out, I think, in several places that may be true, but actually more jobs lost to robots than to other countries.
So it's certainly true that the disappearance of manufacturing jobs is a huge problem here, and that some of the best and most interesting economic studies I found in researching Alienated America were by David Autor, the MIT economist, and he found in places that were competing with China, say they were making the same thing that new Chinese factories were making, after China entered the World Trade Organization, they did see the biggest negative effects economically, but also socially, in a drop-off from marriage and other worse outcomes. But that pointing to the factories closing as the first domino to fall, there's lots of problems with that. It skips intermediate steps, but it doesn't mean that tariffs would save those factory jobs. Especially now, it doesn't mean that it would bring them back. Automation is the main threat. Right now, as a share of our economy, manufacturing is at the same level, basically, that it's been for 2 generations. Since the end of the war, manufacturing as a share of GDP has stayed about the same. Manufacturing employment has gone way down. So that's an indication that it's a matter of, I say robots, but machines. A few people can run a factory in a way that used to take tons and tons of men.
So employment's gone way down. In some ways that means, well, it means that productivity per worker has gone way up.
Yes.
So, we could delight in that, but at the same time, the communities are being ravaged.
That's exactly right. That it's great. Our workers are more productive. But again, it used to be that a guy could graduate high school, and if he's willing to put in the work, show up day after day, and do his job, and work till the whistle blows, and do it for a few years, for 30 years, that's enough to raise a family. If he works some overtime, it's enough probably to get a rowboat and a fishing cabin and have a decent retirement and a pension. That was America in the late 50s and the early 1960s. There was something really good about that. What economists would tell you, though, is there was something inefficient about that, and that we've now gotten greater efficiencies. But if you go to some of the places I went, if you go to Fayette County, Pennsylvania, and you see, right down the road, right down the river from an old steel mill, you see what these efficiencies have done, you have to say, okay, there was a real human cost to this change. Even if it was progress that allowed, us to get our steel for cheaper from Europe and from Asia, even if it was progress that allowed the factories to be run by machines, there's real human costs. It's not just wages go down and we can make up for it with a bigger safety net. There's towns that are just destroyed. There's fewer people getting married. There's more deaths of despair. The economic blow here really has a real human cost.
And I guess at sweet level, you can say, well, these people who have been working here, they can do other types of things. They can go into service and and touch other jobs. But that's at suite level. Or you can say, well, they can move. They can move where there are more jobs. But actually, because community is important, people have family ties, there are lots of reasons why it is not as easy at street level as it looks at suite level.
One of the economist's lines, again, David Autor, the MIT economist, he has a line in one of his papers, I'm not sure I can get it exactly right, but mobility responses to economic shocks are not complete. Meaning, not everybody gets up and leaves when the factory shuts down. There's lots of reasons to stay. One guy, Dave, I talked to in Uniontown, Pennsylvania, he said his mother lives there. So A, she needs him to look after her, but B, because he's on disability, he can't afford rent, so he needs her place to stay in. So he's kind of stuck. But beyond being stuck, a lot of people just want to be in their hometown. And in economics that says, well, you ought to get up and move, that's at least something that's suboptimal, to put it mildly.
Yeah, and I think this is useful what you do here. And let me just refer to one particular thing. Had we kept 2000 in the year 2000, had we kept those levels of productivity and applied them to 2010 levels of production, we would have needed 21 million manufacturing workers rather than 12 million. So there it is. I mean, there's the combination of things. I mean, there is the pressure from China and so forth, but robotics, 3D printing. I think you mentioned, human welder, $25 an hour as opposed to a robotic welder at the equivalent of $8 an hour.
Yeah, and again, it's progress, it's efficiency, but with a real human cost.
And then also, so much of our high school education is designed to push people to college.
Yep.
And not everyone wants to go to college. Not everyone either intellectually or psychologically wants to do that. So in a sense, in a country, if you're going to build stable communities, stable families, you need jobs for people who are not either volitionally or intellectually college material, and we tend to have ignored that.
Yeah, we certainly, our education system ignores that. And when economists and policymakers are thinking about the bigger picture, they ignore that. And there used to just be more sort of mixing of different ability levels, abilities, education levels, et cetera. And Charles Murray wrote about this in Coming in Part. In Newton, Iowa, there would be really bright kids, and they would graduate, and they'd become the principal of the high school. And then, a bunch of perfectly average guys who would be insurance salesmen or gas station workers, and everybody mixed together in the community. But now, because of the mobility, again, progress, efficiency, because of the mobility, the best and brightest often go off to a college many, many miles away and then settle down in one of the highest earning zip codes. And then Newton, Iowa is left with a lot less human capital going on there.
Yeah. You make one other analogy that I think is useful to keep in mind, that let's say if we think of ourselves as purely material or as carbon units, the question is, well, how do we provide most efficiently the number of calories that a carbon unit needs per day? And you point out actually that you could be giving food to people, but if the diner closes down, you're missing something, because the diner isn't just about food, it's also a kind of community center. If you could expand on that a little bit. Yeah,
so it's a funny thing about the way civil society institutions form. A lot of times they're there to fill a more immediate need, but what the most important thing they do is a less immediate, bigger picture need. So I give the example of, what if a politician, I think I used Bernie Sanders, what if he says, look, why do people go to the diner? They go to the diner to get eggs and coffee. So what if we just delivered eggs to everybody every day and gave everybody a coffee maker and delivered them coffee grounds every month? And what if we could do it and still afford to do it? We should definitely do it. And then somebody might say, well, then they're not getting together every day. You say, no, this is better. Now they have their breakfast at home, and they can get together wherever they want. They can go and meet in a park. They can meet in a museum. They could meet on somebody's front porch. But we know how human interactions work. A lot of times you get together just to get together, but especially when you enter into adulthood or start having kids, you get together for a specific purpose. and this is one of the sayings I've encountered a lot in talking to people after writing this book, is they say, yes, people don't come together to come together. They come together to do something. And so this sort of efficiency gained by delivering everybody eggs and coffee would erode a lot of the social capital, the things that tie people together. And that's almost a metaphor for what, again, technological advances have done for us. Our iPhones, our computers, our TVs, our air conditioning, our espresso machines we can have in our house. These things have made life easier, taken away some imperative to go and meet with other people in such a way that I think they've contributed to the erosion of social capital.
Social capital, and you mentioned civil society. I've been thinking for some time and writing about this earlier about the efficiency advantages of civil society as far as providing services to people and helping in that way. But reading your book struck me another aspect of this, that civil society provides opportunities for people to take leadership positions in a variety of ways outside of either government or business. So the person who, let's say, was ambitious could become president of the Elks or the Kiwanis and satisfy that ambition in that way rather than everything falling into the political aspect of things.
No, I think that's a great point. And I remember being in clubs in my 20s. This is a great group, America's Future Foundation, and because everybody who runs it is in the 20s and their board is in the 30s. In my 20s, I had to organize a panel, and then I had to run the committee that organized the panel. And then I ended up on the board at age 28. And because this organization exists, I did that. So that's almost an analogy for having a million of these things on a local level. One of the Aristotle lines I say again and again throughout the book is, man is a political animal. We are supposed not just to shape our own lives, but to shape the world around us. And sometimes conservatives and libertarians get a little apprehensive when they say that, because they think you're talking about being a busybody. But no, we are really supposed to shape the world around us, and a lot of us can do that through our Elks Club, through our parish, through our PTA. For me, it's through our parish, which is also our kids' school, and I coach T-ball. And there's these two big machines out front of the rectory at St. Andrews. One was the one that cut all the grass that was growing in the infield dirt, and then there's a steamroller that rolled it flat. So literally, our baseball field now looks like a baseball field again for the first time in years. And so Silver Spring, Maryland looks different from a satellite picture because of me. But not because of me, but because at my fingertips was an institution, was St. Andrews, where I could get multiple people. They could get volunteers, they could get money, they could get expertise to make this thing happen so that I can coach my T-ball there on Friday night and other kids can play baseball. I'm able to shape the world around me because I'm deeply plugged into these institutions. If you're not, in the case of alienation, then you don't have any good way to shape the world around you. So that's, again, what civil society does, is gives us a playing field on which we get to act as political animals. And
both in Catholicism and Protestant traditions, there's a well-worked-out political philosophy, a subsidiarity within Catholicism, sphere sovereignty within the Protestant Reformed tradition. So we know this stuff. Yeah. And we know it both at an abstract level and also at a practical level. So why have we moved away from it? So a couple of reasons. First is that we say we know this stuff, but I came across a really interesting definition of alienation by Robert Nisbet, who was an American Enterprise Institute scholar back in the day. And he said alienation is the state of being disconnected from society and then not seeing the point of getting reconnected, basically. That once you've lost that connection, you often don't think it serves a purpose. It's like a diner. If you're not going, what's the point if I can get my eggs and coffee here? And then two is just sort of the central planner mindset. People think, okay, the technocratic talk that's been going on at least since the age of Thomas Dewey is, well, if you've got smart enough people with enough power, they can do it much more efficiently than leaving it up to the haphazard nature. And so I do quote Teddy Roosevelt, who believed this very much, that he said, if you're leaving things up to the local level, it's too unequal, too haphazard, where we have a new republic in which we get to
centralize things. And I think that's very much the mindset in Washington, D.C., is that we should centralize the decision-making and almost liberate people from the duty of building their communities is the way that some people see it.
Right. Okay, so let's pivot to politics. And I think you undermine one of the common senses from journalists that looking at, particularly at evangelicals, well, his base is evangelicals, which isn't quite true. I mean, and you distinguish between evangelicals who go to church and, strange though it may be, evangelicals who don't go to church.
Yep. So, first of all, the first distinction to make is between the general election and the early primaries.
Right.
Because the general election is people choosing basically between Donald Trump and Hillary Clinton, with a small fraction voting none of the above. And there's just too many confounding factors, as economists would put that, why you vote, how you vote. But in the early primaries, when Trump entered, and within a couple weeks, he was at 25% of the polls, a lot of those were people who came out of the woodwork, who had been described in 2012, who didn't show up for Romney and were called the missing white voter. These were people who didn't vote or were Democrats, or maybe just had held their nose and voted for other Republicans even. And that 25%, that was his early core support. And it manifests itself if you look at, especially at the Iowa caucuses, but even anything running up into before the Indiana primaries. I focus on Wisconsin as the latest primary I look at there. And there was lots of interesting ways to predict who would be a Trump voter. It wasn't true that Trump voters had lower income or were more likely to be unemployed. As far as personal traits, because we can talk about place later, but as far as personal traits, the biggest factors that predicted it were responding yes to, sometimes I feel like a stranger in my own land. That's about alienation. Your religiosity, that didn't really predict. If you said, religion is really important to me, moderately important to me, not important to me, that didn't predict whether you're going to vote for Trump, Cruz, Rubio, Bush, Kasich, whatever. But when asked how frequently you go to church, that was a major predictor. Donald Trump got over 60% among Republican voters who reported basically never going to church. And he got less than 30% among those who were at church once or more a week. And then other social scientists went out and found different traits, and they said, yeah, the core support of Trump is evangelicals who do not go to church, white evangelicals who do not go to church. Now, some people say, oh, well, then that's because they're bad Christians and they tolerate his immorality. I don't think that's the interesting story, is judging them. I think it's that they're people who didn't belong to anything. For so many, especially middle-class Christians, the local congregation is the heart of their civil society and what they belong to. And so if you don't go to church, you don't belong to anything. You're in a state of alienation. And I think that is why when Trump comes out on stage and says, the American dream is dead. That's what he said in his opening statement. The people he brought into politics and into Republican caucuses and to stand in line outside a rally and outside of Milwaukee, those people were the people who were feeling this alienation and said, yes, the American dream is dead. And on the evangelical score and the Catholic score, et cetera, those were the people who didn't belong to anything. They didn't go to church.
Yeah, I like the way you got granular on this. Let me just quote something. This is comparing the rural Iowa counties of Fremont and Winnebago. Populations have similar incomes, similar educational attainment, similar unemployment, similar crops, mostly corn and soy, but big difference. Winnebago packed with churches, one of the top 10 Iowa counties in terms of religious adherence. Fremont, churches have been closing in 2013 and 2014, is 84th out of 99 as far as religiosity defined as going to church. So early in 2016, Trump received 19% of Winnebago's votes, the church community, 43% of Fremont's, the unchurched. So, yeah.
And you saw that throughout, where if you remember during the 2018 and 2012 primaries, there would be an establishment candidate, either McCain or Romney, and then there was always sort of the evangelical candidate, Mike Huckabee and then Rick Santorum. This map sort of moved everything at about a 90-degree angle, the kind of Cruz versus Trump rally. The evangelical vote from the early elections wasn't really an evangelical vote. It was evangelical vote plus a white populist vote, which is often places that had a Christian tradition, but for a variety of reasons were falling away from that. So Cruz won the evangelical vote in Iowa. Trump won the rural white populist vote in Iowa, and so that map was totally scattered.
Yeah, I could go into a bar and win bets with reporters asking what was Trump's worst county in Iowa, and they would all say either the counties where the University of Iowa is or Iowa State and so forth. No, highly church Sioux County, which I know a little bit because every year in the last couple of weeks of May we have a World Journalism Institute there where we train college kids, and that's at Dordt College.
Yep.
Sioux County is right there, and this was his worst county.
It was his worst county because it was the county where the American dream was the most alive and well, because it was the county that was most dominated by very strong, tightly knit Christian Reformed churches, the Reformed Church of America and the Christian Reformed Church, that they just had done, and the institutions that rippled out from those churches, including the two colleges, they had done an immense job of building up really strong social capital. So families are easier to raise there. People who something goes wrong in their life, their neighbors are more likely to come and sweep them up. It was eye-opening for me. I'm a Catholic from New York. The only ethnicities I really knew were Irish and Italian. So you go out there, everybody's Dutch. The old ladies are named Wilhelmina. The young people are named Holly Vander something.
Right.
And they go to church twice on Sunday, the 9 o'clock and then the 6 o'clock, either Bible study or just a second Sunday service. And just the social trust, the sense of duty to one's neighbor is really high. Then you see all these good outcomes in the places like that, like Western Michigan. Compared to the rest of the country, they have better economic figures, lower dropout rates, all of that. And then in the primaries, all of those Dutch places ended up voting for Ted Cruz, while similarly situated places with lower church attendance voted for Donald Trump.
Yeah, 10 minutes before church starting time, the streets are filled with people strolling to church, and they don't desperately seek a Nietzschean Superman to save them because they have kind of a super dad in their own homes, and it's huge.
One guy at Judy's Diner in Oostburg, Wisconsin, which village of 2,000, it has a Christian Reformed Church, Reformed Church of America, two other, in that Presbyterian Reformed tradition, in this tiny village. And so I was at the diner talking to this guy, Dan, a mechanic, and I said, so what do you, and Dan wasn't necessarily immensely involved in the church, but he loved Oostburg. And I said, so do you have complaints about it? And he said, well, here's what happened to me a couple months ago. I went to my kids, he sends his kids to the public school, so I went to the kids' Christmas concert. There weren't any seats, and I looked around. Half of the parents there sent their kids to the Christian school and didn't even have kids there, or they were like grandparents who their kids had grown and weren't in school anymore. So all the seats were taken up at the Christmas concert. So I said to one of my neighbors, what are you doing here? You don't even have kids at the school. And the neighbor said, well, we have to come see our kids. Using the phrase "our kids" that Robert Putnam used in one of his books. And so he said that's how the community sees all the kids, is they're there to take care of all of them. And brought to mind what a wise woman once said, it takes a village to raise a child.
I've heard that.
Yes, that was Hillary Clinton's book title, of course. And this just got driven home to me while reporting on it. These places are sort of deliberate. People talk about intentional communities. You could look at these Dutch Reformed towns as intentional communities to make family formation and family rearing easier, better, and more likely to be successful.
So what do you do at this point? You write about drive-by closed or mostly empty churches in Buchanan County, Virginia. Virginia's a little bit of Appalachia. Mm-hmm. It's no surprise that Trump did great in Buchanan. A Pew survey in March 2016 showed Trump down by 16 points among white evangelicals who attended church weekly and up 19 points among those who did not. So what do we do? I mean, if you were, you can't put the genie back into the bottle at this point. What do you do?
And you can't make like a federal department of everybody go to church or a federal department of engagement. So as far as solutions, the first one, like a lot of the Ten Commandments, I could give some thou shalt nots. The federal government should stop harming civil society. One main way it does it is it crowds out nonprofits and churches. Another, though, is explicitly chasing the church out of the public square. And so there's a lawsuit against Catholic hospitals for not aborting some of their patients. There's the federal government, the side they took in Hobby Lobby. The argument they made in church under the Obama administration was there is no free exercise in religion once you've entered into the marketplace. And then Nancy Pelosi, when asked about the Little Sisters of the Poor case, where Catholic nuns are being forced to cover contraceptive, she said, well, I do my religion on Sundays. And other days when I try to go to Mass, and I think it's great. If she goes to Mass daily, she's a lot better than I am at that. But you can't do your religion on Sundays, and you can't do your religion only when you go to Mass. And Obama, when he would say freedom of worship, that's obviously not in the Constitution. It's a free exercise of religion. So the government has to stop getting in the way of people's exercise of religion, because for the middle class and the working class, church has always been the core problem, the core institution of civil society, and alienation is a core problem of the working class and the middle class. So step one is to stop chasing the church and other institutions of civil society out of the public square. After that, there are more local things. I mean, one, we were talking about walking to church in, Holland, Michigan, or places like that. Building communities more for people than just for cars, I think would help. We have a tax code that subsidizes people buying bigger houses. I'm for houses that are big enough for you to have as many kids as you want to have.
You have 6.
We
right?
have 6, yes, and just got our second dog. And so I'm not saying people have to have small houses. I'm saying our tax code subsidizing bigger houses might be subsidizing a little bit of alienation by drawing people away from each other and more into their homes. But ultimately, it's going to take something of a great awakening of civil society and local churches, church communities doing it. And a lot of that is going to be reformed by the institutions, specifically the churches. They don't escape the blame for people falling away from civil society. Churches that have either become overly politicized, or my own church that covered up horrific abuses, or churches that that either went too lukewarm or tried to become too modern and then weren't any different from day-to-day life and chased away people by not offering, by not actually talking about their core beliefs. So that's going to be a big part of it, is existing churches doing a better job of being distinctive and not just trying to blend in with the world. And then also I have friends who are engaged in the church planting effort. That if you're going to plant a new church, plant it as a community institution that's distinctive from the broader culture, that will bring people together and offer something they're not getting, by watching either Fox News or Home and Garden Television.
And church planting, at least in some denominations, the hot places are either inner city places where there's a certain buzz and excitement, or very affluent communities where there's a lot of economic support, and the people in the middle, in Appalachia, for example, tend to that's not a hot destination
if
for
you
church
end up
planting.
in Buchanan County, Virginia, or Fremont County, Iowa, then you are really on the ground fighting this plague of alienation.
Yeah. Okay. None of you is alienated here because you're all going to be asking questions right away. So let's see. There's a microphone, and ask away. There's a non-alienated person with his hand up.
Well, first, thank you so much for coming. I guess my question has to do with sort of your diner analogy and how you made the argument that government intervention can damage sort of social goods that are going on in a community, and that the free market has a good response for that. But how would you characterize companies like Amazon or online marketplaces where people are increasingly not going to stores, not going to marketplaces with other people and buying and having things shipped directly to their homes?
I think that's a great question, and I think it's another example of progress at a price. I mean, for my wife, where if it's the summer or a weekend or after school, her bringing 6 kids to the store can be really difficult. And so having somebody able to deliver it, this is not just sort of like a frivolity. This is really a benefit to our quality of life, being able to do that. But downtowns are shutting down, and it's an inadequate conservative response to either strip malls replacing downtowns or Amazon replacing both, to say, well, now people have more disposable income. Well, some people do, but if that's not currently directing things towards building community, then there's a good argument that we're suffering on net. My next 2 responses would be, I don't trust the government to do anything about this without making the problem worse. But also, humans are resilient. And while this is something I want to wrap my mind around, because I just really started to think it through near the end of the book, was, well, individually, often our inertia drags us towards solitude. Somehow, culturally, there's a natural thing that brings us back together. And technology shocks often change things, and we get scattered, and then sometimes we come back together. So when I think about smartphones, which if you have like 14-year-old nieces, they might spend all their time at a family. You never see Uncle Steve, and now you're ignoring him to be on your Insta Snapchat. But then you think, okay, if we are resilient, and this is me just being optimistic, I'm not confident. If we are resilient, within a few years, we'll say, oh, well, yeah, or a few decades, there was a period where these smartphones just dragged us apart, but now they mostly serve to bring us together. Or, Amazon killed the old downtown, and now downtown is completely different. So that's sort of my hope. So I'm saying I don't have a great answer for your question. I think it's a great question, but I do note that, the 1960s was something of a peak, the early 1960s, a peak of civil society. And that was America sort of coming to terms with a new post-war reality and finding a way to really make it work in a way that it hadn't been before.
Thank you for coming. You mentioned the Nesbitt quote of individuals who not only are without community but fail to see the draw for community anymore. That's such a sad quote when you think about it, isn't it? It's this idea of this despair, and which I think that's what you're kind of getting, this despair quotient. So what can institutions of civil society do to help people see the value of reconnecting?
I think, thinking of the diner, offer them a very immediate, tangible benefit, what we Catholics call sort of the corporal works of mercy. And start with that. And you know what? If it's for one of the works that churches were providing, one of the services was, here's an opportunity for you to serve other people. Like, if you want to feed the hungry, often showing up at your church is the only way to do it. So that's one thing. The corporal works of mercy works both ways. And that would sort of be where I would start. I think that's got very sound footing in the Bible, too, is I'm going to cure blind people, not because they're seeing literally is the important thing, but that will bring people to me and then to the ultimate reward. So that's what I would do I think that provides a nice metaphor. Offer people something they're not otherwise getting. And it might not be something they could get from Amazon, unless it's a really poor community. But if it's a sort of middle-class, alienated community, what can you offer them that they're not otherwise getting? And so with my own parish, what I say suburban, middle-class, upper-middle-class parents need is a place to bring their children and ignore their children while they socialize with other adults. And so this is why I do my T-ball thing, is because there's playground and ball fields and kids are riding bikes. So you bring your kids, there's burgers on a Friday, and you mostly ignore your kids. Because T-ball isn't really that important, but everybody in the parish coming together. So that's what I would say to bring in the alienated. If you don't see the point of civil society, we're going to show it to you, even if it's just a cheeseburger on a Friday night.
I think that's such an important point, because so many times we can find ourselves just railing at the darkness instead of living out a better story and inviting people into that story.
Yep.
Hi, thanks for coming. So we have at this college a lot of students who are middle class, upper middle class, doing well, and they're from all over the country, and they're from the kind of communities that are, I think, vulnerable to the kind of alienation that you talk about. So what would you say to a bunch of college students to encourage them to kind of see beyond their own individual aspirations and say, if you really wanted to motivate them in this area, what would you say?
Oh gosh, that's a great question. And the fact is that I think there's probably something natural to somebody at age 20 in our human nature that makes them more likely to be more self-centered. And I don't mean that in the worst way, but I just remember even me reading my Aristotle and my Plato and my Homer and thinking about virtue, it was all sort of self-improvement. It was like a commercial about a home gym or something. I'm going to make myself better. And virtue obviously is mostly about how you interact with other people. And so even like the most scrupulous kids at that age, there's something natural that's going to guide them towards thinking more about themselves than that. And I think our modern society does that too. Again, self-improvement, all that stuff gets brought down to almost a vanity at some point in our culture. And so it's hard to break through. Could you do it by driving home how much they benefited from these strong institutions? Maybe. I mean, I'm sort of guessing here because you're the first one to ask me this question. Could you do it from saying, hey, look, your parents immersed you in this and this, and they hustled to do this, and here at this school, what you benefited from is living and working side by side with people engaged in the same higher pursuit of higher ideas, something outside of yourself. So this is happiness. This is what, that the pursuit of something outside of yourself is happiness. This is what you benefited from. That's kind of how I would do a pep talk if you put me on the spot to do it.
Thanks for being here. You mentioned that the church is or should be greatly involved in community involvement. To what extent is that true? And is there any boundary to where you'd put the church in the community?
So is there any boundary? Yeah, so Tocqueville says the church and churches in America are not directly involved in politics, but they are the foremost of their political institutions. So you're sort of using political two different ways there. What I would say, and this is this was a way in which I didn't like where Trump was going when he first started talking about religious liberty. When I think of religious liberty, again, I think I should not be compelled by the state to act against my conscience. No cake baker, no nuns, nothing. That's religious liberty. He first used it to say preachers should be free to talk about politics more from the pulpit. Obviously, you have to be able to talk about politics if you're talking about morality and applying it to the real world, but he really wanted pastors to be able to endorse politicians. I don't see a virtue in that. My church has, when it's gotten involved in politics more directly, has been more on the left. A lot of Southern evangelical churches have become very Republican, again, looking like Fox News. I think that can be detrimental. What I would say is this. Again, the main thing church offers is something supernatural and not of this world. But as far as what it's going to try to offer of this world, it should be something that's different from day-to-day life. So to get out there and to say, we need to make sure that we pass this tax cut or something like that. No, there's no church role there. Even aside from the question that's outside of the core competencies of Christian, Jewish, Muslim teaching, etc. It's sort of profaning themselves. So that's what I would say is you've got to be able to touch on politics, but to become political would be to go too far. But as far as the other important aspects of life, youth sports, there's always been a strong church involvement in that. Education, you can't separate education from morality, and you can't separate morality from faith, so they've got to be involved in that. So I have a very expansive view. If there's something that the private sector and the government aren't providing aren't providing well, the churches that have resources ought to step up and say, how can we provide this, with the exception of some, deep involvement in the nitty-gritty of politics.
Now, in 2016, Donald Trump clearly rode a wave. He got this in some way, and he was able to appeal. I mean, it may have just happened, it may have been planned, but whatever. Looking forward to next year, 2020. Number one, do any of the umpty-ump number of Democratic candidates now get this in any productive way? And then number two, what are Trump's prospects as you look at them?
So sometimes Sherrod Brown, who's now not running, seemed to get it. He would talk about the dignity of work, realizing that people need to feel needed. You asked earlier about the connection of dropping out of the workforce and not being married. One of the connecting things is these are men who end up not feeling like they have a point in life.
Right.
Brown, though, dropped out. Pete Buttigieg, the mayor of South Bend, he has talked similarly about one of the problems of the loss of good union jobs is that the union wasn't just negotiating for wages. It was a institution of civil society that brings people together, and people need that sort of solidarity and camaraderie, and that increasingly in the modern world, that's absent. So he said the closest to saying a sentence that could have ended up in Alienated America. Again, at times he sort of tried to chase the church out of the public square in South Bend with the pro-life clinics. So I think a lot of what would be interesting though would be when Democrats took the House, a huge number of those takeovers this last year were in the strong upper middle class communities, which, as I lay out in a couple different parts of the book, actually do have pretty tightly knit communities. Even if they're basically secular places, the Little Leagues, the parents are really involved in the schools, the parents have alumni networks, the families are more likely to be intact, which is crucial. Those places where the American dream is alive, not because of church, but because sort of they're elite enclaves, those are places that were 50-50 in 2016 and tilted more pro-Democrat in 2018. If they stay with whomever the Democrat nominates, then it'll be an incredible thing where if you look at white voters, you'll have an easy majority of college-educated white voters voting for the Democrat and an easy majority of non-college educated white voters voting for the Republicans, sort of a flip on what we expected 20 years ago.
Right.
So that's one thing I'm looking for, where the non-alienated Christian voters in Oostburg are going to vote for Trump in part because the church is under attack by the Democrats and in part because he's appointed conservative judges. The non-alienated upper middle class places, those might tack hard towards Democrats, and that would flip Michigan and Pennsylvania.
And among Republicans, again, Trump seems to get this in a way, but it's not necessarily thought out. It just
Yes.
So among Republicans, do you see some thoughtful folks who understand about civil society and?
A little bit, because some Republicans are more geared towards real localism, and so when I look at Republicans, to some extent, Justin Amash, who's from Western Michigan, so he has those strong Dutch places, and then also knows that a lot of rural central Michigan is suffering from this collapse of community. So some of these districts that span both the rural alienation and the really strong church communities, they see firsthand. So Amash is the one that I've had a personal conversation with, and he just said, absolutely, you know where to show up to find people on a Sunday in some of these towns, and in other places, there's no place to go because the people aren't coming together enough.
Okay. Other questions? We have time for maybe one more. Who would like to ask?
You don't have to say this authoritatively or on the record per se, but is Amash your top pick for 2020?
No, I don't think anybody is going to challenge. I mean, Justin Amash is talking about challenging Trump in 2020. No Republican is going to beat Donald Trump in the Republican primary in 2020. I shouldn't make predictions anymore because I predicted Trump wasn't going to be our president. But that's kind of far-fetched. I would love to vote for somebody like him in 2020, in 2024, or something like that, in part because of exactly what I was talking about. He sees that part of the reason he's a libertarian-ish Republican is because he knows that access to the good life doesn't come from a government program or anything like that. It comes from people having this sphere of freedom on the local level to set up these institutions, build these communities where people can raise family. He's not Dutch Reform. He's Orthodox of some sort, but he definitely sees the importance of that. I don't think most politicians in Washington see that. I think they forget it by the time they've been there for a couple of years, and they start to think that Washington has the answers.
So you'd think that if there are perhaps 17 Democratic candidates,
I think that's low.
that's probably low. Let's say we're in the 20s already.
Yeah.
Wouldn't there be logically someone who's pro-life, who would be in order, obviously not to win,
Yeah.
but would get a significant segment of the vote?
No, I think the Democrats have driven the pro-life segment thoroughly out of their party. And I do think that a big part of Trump's appeal was saying, lock her up. There are a lot of people who just saw the Clintons get away with such abuses of power and then saw them get filthy rich afterwards while she's a senator or secretary of state and seemed to constantly get away with it. And Trump was a guy who said they're not going to get away with it anymore. And somebody like Kamala Harris on the other side is a person who I would think of as a front runner, in part as a former prosecutor. She sort of talks about punishing the other side, and a lot of that is punishing religious conservatives. She's gone after, if you're in the Knights of Columbus, the largest volunteer organization in America, as far as I know, you're too radical to be there. So I think this is not an optimistic note, but I do think that there's a lot of desire to, on that side, to attack the very institutions that I'm talking about, to see them as, you guys lost a culture war, and now we're going to stamp you out. I don't think that's the way the average Democratic voter is, but I think enough is that way to, in this crowded field, end up carrying the primary.
So, and since neither you nor I was very good in predicting this last election, we can leave this off the official transcript if you want.
Yeah.
But is there anyone you cheer for among the Democratic candidates?
Is there anyone I would cheer for among the Democratic candidates? I can't think of one. Kamala Harris is the one I would fear the most. There are things about Pete Buttigieg that are likable. Tim Ryan, the congressman who thought about challenging Nancy Pelosi, is thinking about running for president. He's not pro-life, but he does have this sort of blue-collar sensibility, and I would assume, coming from Ohio, he also sees a little bit about how the erosion of local community is there at the thing. So almost because I don't know enough about him, Tim Ryan's the closest I can give you to an answer.
Okay, and then on the Republican side, so Justin Amash is interesting. And obviously not in 2020, but 2024 and beyond. Other Republicans we should just look for, follow?
Well, so non-presidential one, Mike Lee, the senator from Utah, is the one who understands this all the best. He's a chairman of the Joint Economic Committee, and he's been running something called the Social Capital Project, which is some of the data was stuff they turned out just in time for my book about the erosion of civil society. Mormon Utah, we haven't mentioned it yet, but I mean, talk about building strong communities through a church. They do it excellently, and he understands this very well and is not tempted to think that Washington, D.C. Can solve the problem. So he's definitely sort of the senator who gets it the best. Ben Sasse is pretty close. I was kind of worried. He wrote a book. I was worried that it was going to be the same as my book, and it was overlap. He didn't talk about church enough. But his book called Them is about how our politics are so fractious, in part because we don't have the ability to settle things on a local human level, so everything becomes on this inhuman level where you're signing up for a massive team and the stakes are so high. Sass and Lee are the most interesting senators to me as far as people who get this problem and firm commitment to the pro-life cause and all of that.
Yeah. One last question. Okay.
You mentioned living in Silver Spring.
Yes.
And that your parish was also leaned left. So obviously you've learned to cross partisan lines. And how do you do that? Because we have such a, we have sorted so
Yep.
well along political lines.
So if you're running a coach pitch baseball team with first and second graders alongside with, and I've had people who I do this very close with, who we had politically tinted fights that actually almost got a little bit personal, politically tinted disagreements. At some point, those things are going to fade away, and you're going to realize that even though your politics matter to you, even if it's about life or about, for a lot of Catholics on the left, the immigration question is totally central to them as a question of human dignity. Even if you end up having disagreements about things that matter, I think if you do work together with these people and just clean up after bingo night, that does the good work of creating the bonding and that sort of thing. And so that means less time watching cable or being on Twitter and more time being out there and doing it. That's one of the reasons I think this is so important, is that the fractiousness would go down the more that people are, if you need to bring in another coach to do relief pitching because your arm is tired after throwing 40 pitches to little Bobby, then you're going to not care what his politics are. No, don't, or throw it high and tight, no.
Right. Okay, and compassionate conservatism, I assume, is not just mostly dead, but totally, absolutely, fully dead. Is that?
I mean, in an era of lock her up, I do think it's got a long way to go.
Good. Well, thank you very much for coming. Please join me in thanking Tim.
Thank you.